What would you do if you found yourself completely alone, cut off behind enemy lines, with no food, no backup, and no way home? For most soldiers, this nightmare scenario would mean capture or death. But for one American paratrooper in the autumn of 1944, it became a test of survival that would last 72 brutal hours. This is the story of Private First Class Charles H. Coolidge, soldier who fought alone for 3 days in the forests of eastern France, and what happened next would earn him the nation's highest honor. October 1944. The Allied advance across France had slowed to a bloody crawl. While the headlines celebrated liberation, the reality on the ground told a different story. The German Wehrmacht, though battered and retreating, still possessed teeth. And in the dense forests near the French-German border, those teeth were about to close on one isolated American soldier. To understand how Charles Coolidge found himself in this impossible situation, we must first understand the strategic landscape of October 1944. Following the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, Allied forces had reached the borders of the Third Reich itself, but the easy victories of late summer were over. German resistance had stiffened dramatically. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The autumn rains had begun, turning roads to mud and forests to swamps. The 36th Infantry Division, part of Lieutenant General Alexander Patch's 7th Army, had been fighting its way through the Vosges Mountains since early October. These weren't the gentle, rolling hills of Normandy. The Vosges were steep, densely forested, and militarily nightmarish. Every ridge concealed German positions. Every valley became a killing ground. Charles Coolidge was 24 years old, a native of Signal Mountain, Tennessee. He'd been drafted in 1942 and had served with distinction through the Italian campaign before his unit was pulled north for the invasion of southern France in August 1944. By October, he was a squad leader in M Company, 3rd Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment. Coolidge was not a typical soldier. Even among the hardened veterans of the 36th Division, he stood out. His men respected him not for bravado or recklessness, but for something rarer: calm competence under fire. When shells landed, Coolidge didn't flinch. When orders seemed impossible, he found a way. When his men looked to him for guidance, they saw a leader who wouldn't abandon them. But on October 24th, 1944, that loyalty would be tested in ways no one could have imagined. The 141st Infantry had been ordered to seize a series of ridgelines east of Belmont-sur-Buttant, forgettable village whose only strategic value was its position along the axis of advance toward the German border. Intelligence reports suggested light resistance, perhaps a company of German infantry, maybe some artillery support. Intelligence was wrong. The attack jumped off at 0600 hours on October 24th. M Company led the advance, with Coolidge's squad on the left flank. The morning was cold and gray, typical for late October in the Vosges. Visibility in the forest was measured in yards, not miles. Every tree could hide an enemy soldier. Every shadow could be death. For the first hour, the advance proceeded smoothly, too smoothly. Veterans knew what silence meant in these forests. It meant the Germans were watching, waiting, choosing their moment. At 0715 hours, that moment arrived. The German counterattack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. These weren't the garrison troops or teenage conscripts that had become increasingly common in the German ranks. These were veterans, likely from the 16th Volksgrenadier Division, men who knew their business. Machine gun fire raked M Company's positions. Mortar began dropping with mechanical precision, walking back and forth across the American line. Within minutes, the advance had become a desperate fight for survival. Coolidge's squad found itself pinned down in a shallow depression, inadequate cover against the storm of fire sweeping over them. To their front, German infantry were advancing in short rushes, professional and methodical. To their flanks, other American units were falling back under the weight of the assault. The company commander, recognizing that the position was untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal. The platoons began pulling back by squads, covering each other's movement with suppressive fire. It was textbook infantry tactics, executed under the worst possible conditions. But in the chaos and confusion of combat, in the smoke and noise and terror, mistakes happen. Coolidge's squad was supposed to be the last to withdraw, providing covering fire for the rest of the platoon. But somewhere in the noise and confusion, communications broke down. The squad on their right pulled back early. The squad on their left never received the withdrawal order and had already been overrun. By the time Coolidge realized what was happening, M Company was gone. He and his 8 remaining men were alone, 300 yards behind what had become the new German front line, cut off, surrounded. With night approaching, and no way to reach friendly forces, any soldier in that situation faces a terrible choice: surrender, attempt an immediate breakout, or dig in and hope for rescue. Each option carries its own risks. Surrender meant a POW camp, if you were lucky, or a bullet if you weren't. An immediate breakout in daylight Cross open ground swept by German fire was suicide. Digging in meant becoming a target once the Germans realized you were there. Coolidge made his decision quickly. They would wait for darkness, then attempt to infiltrate back through German lines. In the meantime, they needed to find better cover and stay undetected. The squad withdrew deeper into the forest, moving with agonizing slowness, freezing at every sound. German voices echoed through the trees and not distant battlefield sounds, but nearby conversation. The enemy was consolidating their new positions, bringing up supplies, evacuating their wounded. The forest that had seemed empty that morning was now crawling with German soldiers. By nightfall, Coolidge and his men had found a small ravine, partially protected by fallen logs and thick underbrush. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. They settled in to wait for darkness, weapons ready, barely breathing, listening to German soldiers pass within yards of their position. Then the first complication arrived. Private James Morrison, the youngest member of the squad, had been hit during the initial German assault. At the time, it seemed minor. A fragment from a mortar shell had struck his leg, painful but not life-threatening. But as the hours passed and shock wore off, the wound began to bleed more heavily. Morrison was growing pale, his breathing shallow. He needed medical attention. Soon, Coolidge faced another impossible decision. Morrison needed help that only an aid station could provide. But any attempt to move him would reveal their position and doom them all. And even if they tried, Morrison likely wouldn't survive the journey. As darkness fell on October 24th, Coolidge made the hardest call of his military career. He would attempt to get Morrison through German lines that night. The others would follow, moving as a group, staying together no matter what. It was a decision born of desperation and loyalty, and it would prove to be catastrophic. The infiltration attempt began at 2,200 hours. The night was moonless. The darkness in the forest absolute. This was both advantage and danger. They couldn't see the Germans, but the Germans couldn't see them either. Every step had to be tested. Every branch and leaf a potential betrayal. Coolidge took point, with Morrison supported between two other men. They moved at a crawl, stopping every few feet to listen. German voices guided them not toward safety, but around danger. A cough to the left meant Germans in that direction. Struck match to the right revealed a sentry position. The forest had become a maze of enemies, and they were rats trying to find the exit. For 2 hours, they made progress. Agonizingly slow, terrifyingly vulnerable, but progress nonetheless. Coolidge estimated they'd covered perhaps 200 yards, about halfway to where friendly lines should be. Then Private Morrison moaned. It was involuntary, the sound of a man in severe pain trying and failing to remain silent. But in the dead silence of the forest, it might as well have been a scream. A German voice called out sharply, "Halt, we're da." Coolidge froze, his mind racing. 30 yards away, maybe less, a German sentry had heard them. In seconds, the entire sector would be alert. They could surrender, fight, or run. All three options were death sentences for different reasons. What happened next would be debated by Coolidge's surviving men for the rest of their lives. Coolidge gave one short, sharp hand signal: scatter. The squad broke in different directions, each man abandoning the group movement in favor of individual survival. It was against every instinct, every principle of infantry combat. You never leave your men. Never. But in that moment, Coolidge made the calculation that 8 men moving individually through darkness had better odds than 8 men caught as a group. The forest erupted in chaos. Flares burst overhead, turning night to harsh chemical day. 8 German voices shouted commands. Machine guns opened fire, spraying the forest at random, hoping to hit something. Anything. The disciplined infiltration became a panicked rout. Coolidge ran, not away from the Germans. That direction was certain capture. Not toward friendly lines, that was now impossible. And instead, he ran parallel to the German positions. Deeper into the contested forest, into the no-man's land between the opposing forces. Behind him, he heard screams, some in English, some in German, the sound of men dying in darkness. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. He ran until the sounds of combat faded behind him. He ran until he stumbled into a shell crater and collapsed, gasping, alone. When dawn broke on October 25th, Charles Coolidge was 3 miles behind German lines, separated from his men with no food, no water, and only the ammunition in his rifle and the determination to survive. The 3-day ordeal had only just begun. The first day alone taught Coolidge brutal lessons about survival behind enemy line. Lesson 1. Movement equals death. Twice that morning, German patrols passed within 20 yards of his crater. Both times, he pressed himself into the mud at the bottom, controlling his breathing, willing himself to become invisible. Both times, they passed without detecting him. But the message was clear. This forest was thick with enemy soldiers. Any movement in daylight was suicide. It's lesson 2. Thirst is worse than hunger. By midday, Coolidge's throat was raw with thirst. There was water in the bottom of the crater, contaminated and foul, but water nonetheless. He drank it, knowing he might pay later with dysentery, but that was a tomorrow problem. Today's problem was staying alive. Lesson 3. Hope is both salvation and torture. Throughout that first day, Coolidge heard American artillery in the distance. His division was still fighting, still advancing. They were out there, perhaps only a mile or two away, but between him and safety lay hundreds of German soldiers, all on high alert after the previous night's infiltration attempt. As the sun set on October 25th, Coolidge had survived one day, but surviving and escaping were different things. He needed a plan. The obvious route straight toward American lines was impossible. The Germans would be watching for exactly that, with sentries and patrols covering every logical escape path. The entire frontline sector was a death trap for any American soldier trying to slip through. So Coolidge made a counterintuitive decision. Instead of moving toward safety, he would move deeper behind German lines. He would circle around the enemy positions, come at friendly lines from an unexpected direction from behind the German rear. It was insane. It was also his only chance. That night, October 25th to 26th, Coolidge began moving again. Not the panicked flight of the previous night, but calculated movement, slow and methodical. He avoided all paths and trails. He moved through the densest brush, where movement was torture but detection was less likely. Every 100 yards he stopped to listen and observe, and he began to notice something. The German positions weren't uniform. There were gaps, seams in their line where units met, where command responsibility was unclear. These seams were his opportunity. Dawn on October 26th found Coolidge 5 miles behind German positions, deeper in enemy territory than he'd been when the ordeal started. But he was alive, and he had a plan forming. The second day brought new challenges. Hunger was now a constant companion. Coolidge had been without food for 48 hours. His body was beginning to consume itself, muscles weakening, thoughts becoming sluggish. But stopping to forage was impossible. This wasn't wilderness survival. This was enemy territory, where every farm, every village, every crossroads was occupied by German troops. Around midday, luck intervened. Coolidge discovered an abandoned German supply dump, likely created during their previous retreat and forgotten in the chaos. There wasn't much, some moldy bread, canned meat of dubious origin, and 2 canteens of water. To Coolidge, it was a feast. He ate carefully, not too much too fast, knowing his stomach would rebel against sudden nourishment. The food brought clarity. His mind sharpened. And with that clarity came a dangerous realization. He'd been thinking about this wrong. He wasn't trapped behind German lines. The Germans didn't know he was here. To them, he was just another casualty, another American soldier lost in the chaos of combat. He wasn't being hunted. He was simply trying to avoid being accidentally discovered. That psychological shift changed everything. Coolidge began moving with more confidence, not recklessly, but with purpose. He studied German patrol patterns. He noted their schedules, their habits. German soldiers, he realized, were creatures of routine, even in combat. Patrols passed at roughly the same times. Guard shifts changed at predictable intervals. There was order in the chaos, if you knew how to see it. By the evening of October 26th, Coolidge had circled completely around the German position. He was now behind their rear echelon, in an area with fewer combat troops and more supply personnel. The combat soldiers were alert and dangerous. Supply troops were bored and complacent. As darkness fell on the second night, Coolidge began his final infiltration. Not toward the front lines, but toward a road he'd observed throughout the day. A road that ran perpendicular to the front, connecting German rear areas to their combat positions. A road that, if he followed it in the right direction, would eventually curve back toward American-controlled territory. It was a gamble. Roads meant traffic. Traffic meant Germans. But roads also meant navigation, a way to move quickly and avoid getting lost in the dark forest. Coolidge waited until midnight, then stepped onto that road and began walking. Not sneaking, not crawling. Walking as if he belonged there. As if he had every right to be on this German road in the middle of the night. It was the boldest move of his entire ordeal. And for 3 hours, it worked. October 27th arrived, with Coolidge still walking. He'd covered nearly 8 miles on the road, moving with the confidence of exhaustion, too tired to be properly afraid anymore. Twice, German vehicles passed him. Both times he simply stepped to the side of the road, head down, as if he were a German soldier who'd been separated from his unit. In the darkness, at a distance, one muddy, exhausted soldier looked much like another. Both times, the vehicles drove on without stopping. But as dawn approached, Coolidge knew his luck was running out. Daylight would reveal what darkness had hidden: his American uniform, his American equipment, his American face. He needed to get off the road and find cover before sunrise. The road had brought him into a valley he didn't recognize from his briefing maps. Hills rose on either side, dense forests giving way to farmland. The growing light, he could see a village, perhaps a mile ahead. German occupied, certainly. But beyond that village, the terrain rose again, and Coolidge's instincts told him that American lines were somewhere in those hills. He left the road and moved into a hedgerow bordering a field. The cover was thin, inadequate, but it was all that was available. As the sun rose fully on October 27th, Coolidge found himself lying in a muddy ditch, watching German soldiers move through the village below, calculating his next move. Throughout that third day, Coolidge waited. German activity in the village was constant: trucks moving supplies, soldiers marching to and from the front, officers conferring over maps. The Wehrmacht machine was functioning with typical German efficiency. Everyone focused on their tasks, no one noticing one American soldier lying in a ditch 600 yards away. As the afternoon wore on, Coolidge heard something that made his heart race. American artillery. Not distant this time, but close, very close. And the shells were landing beyond the village, in the hills where German positions presumably waited. American forces were advancing. His division was attacking. If he could just survive a few more hours, the front lines might move to him. Okay? But survival meant staying hidden. Staying hidden was becoming harder by the hour. German soldiers were withdrawing from forward positions, falling back through the village in organized retreat. The area was filling with enemy troops, all moving in his direction, all potentially able to see his position. Then, at approximately 1600 hours, Coolidge's 3-day ordeal took its most dangerous turn yet. A German patrol, 8 men led by an unaerophisier, left the village and began moving directly toward his hedgerow. They weren't searching for him specifically, likely just checking the area before the withdrawal continued. But in 2 minutes, they would walk right past his hiding spot. Detection was inevitable. Coolidge had come 70 miles, survived 3 days, evaded hundreds of German soldiers. And now, with American forces possibly within artillery range, with rescue finally possible, he faced his final impossible choice. He could surrender. After 3 days alone, no one would question that decision. He'd done more than anyone could expect. Or he could fight. 8 Germans versus 1 American. Low on ammunition, weak from hunger, exhausted beyond measure. The mathematics of combat said this was suicide. But Charles Coolidge had not come this far to surrender in a ditch. What happened in the next 30 seconds would become legendary in the 36th Infantry Division. A story told and retold, growing with each telling, but never quite capturing the desperate reality of that moment. Coolidge rose from the ditch and opened fire. His first burst from his M1 Garand caught the German patrol leader, dropping him instantly. The remaining Germans, shocked by the sudden attack, scattered for cover, but Coolidge had surprise and desperation on his side. He moved as he fired, changing positions, making the Germans think they faced multiple opponents rather than one exhausted American. In the chaos, 3 more Germans fell. The remaining 4, disoriented and under fire from an unknown number of attackers, made the rational decision. They retreated, falling back toward the village, calling for reinforcements. Coolidge didn't wait. He ran. Not toward the village, not back into the forest. He ran perpendicular to the German positions, along the hedgerow, moving as fast as his exhausted legs would carry him. Behind him, he heard German voices rallying, organizing a response. Ahead, he heard something else. English. Ghent. American voices calling out to each other, coordinating movement. Combat commands in English. Beautiful English. The most beautiful sound Charles Coolidge had ever heard. He stumbled out of the hedgerow and into an advanced position of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, the 36th Division's adjacent unit. American soldiers, startled by the appearance of this mud-covered, barely conscious soldier emerging from German territory, nearly shot him before recognizing his uniform. Coolidge collapsed. The ordeal was over. The official after-action report filed on October 28, 1944, recorded the incident in typical military understatement. PFC Charles H. Coolidge separated from his unit during enemy counterattack on 24. Oct successfully evaded capture and returned to friendly lines on the 27th of October. But the full story, pieced together from Coolidge's debriefing and German records captured later, told a more complete picture. Charles Coolidge had traveled nearly 15 miles through enemy-controlled territory. He'd evaded dozens of German patrols. He'd survived on contaminated water and salvaged rations. And in the final moments, when surrender seemed the only option, he'd fought his way out. Of his 8-man squad, only 2 others survived. Private Morrison died of his wounds during the scattered breakout on the first night. 4 others were captured and spent the rest of the war in POW camps. 1 other soldier, whose name was never officially recorded, successfully infiltrated back through German lines on his own, arriving at American positions 2 days before Coolidge. For his actions during those 3 days, and for subsequent heroism during the continued fighting in the Vosges Mountains, Charles Coolidge would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation specifically mentioned his extraordinary heroism and intrepidity while separated from his unit. Though the full story remained classified for years, Coolidge survived the war. He returned to Tennessee, married, raised a family, and rarely spoke of his 3 days alone behind enemy lines. When asked about it in later years, he would only say that he'd done what any soldier would do: he tried to get home. Charles H. Coolidge died in 2021 at the age of 99. One of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, his obituary mentioned his award, service, his family. It did not mention because there was no way to adequately capture what it meant to be alone in enemy territory for 3 days. Nothing but training, instinct, and sheer determination to survive. The story of Charles Coolidge reminds us that heroism isn't always about grand battles or strategic victories. Sometimes it's about one soldier, alone in the darkness, making the decision to keep fighting, to keep moving, to refuse surrender, even when surrender seems rational. In the vast machinery of World War II, where divisions and armies clashed, it's easy to forget that the war was fought by individuals, men like Charles Coolidge, who found themselves in impossible situations and somehow found the strength to survive. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Secrets. Reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.